Hi, welcome back to another TerranScapes video. Today in this video I want to show you the completed shore boards. They've had some additions made to them since I had shown you the previous board that I'd finished. I've tried some new techniques inside the water for vegetation. I'll show you how that came out. And discuss some of the challenges that these boards present, as this has been a pretty unique project, and I've said that in the past, and each of those projects was unique as well. But I mean, pouring this volume of resin, trying to get these boards to match up, it has been a difficult project, and so I want to share with you some of those caveats, especially if it's something that you want to undertake for yourself. So let's take a closer look and point out some of these new features. So just panning around the board, one of the things that you'll notice is that I've added in some sort of weedy material along the shoreline. A couple pieces of driftwood or scattered debris of some small logs, that sort of idea along the shore. And now, having completed the two boards, can match them up to show some of how that union is working out. One of the things, and I don't know if it's going to pick up in this, I think it's picking it up very lightly, so we'll see when I look at the final color rendering, is that if you look at, let me see if I pull back here just a little bit so we can take the boards in together. The board on the left, and this is fairly obvious, the board on the left is a much larger area of water, and added, when I carved this foam, this board actually sits a little lower. And also, I ended up carving it a little bit more shallow. I'm not sure whether the blade carved a little deeper or whether it was a factor that the foam was a little bit thinner. But what it meant is that because of both the area, normally, okay, so I had to pour a lot more resin on this side. Let's just put it that way. This board weighs 5 pounds, and it's all resin. So this took a lot of resin to do that, but it had produced an effect which I'll show you up close that's unique and I think makes it valid in that sense. But because this ended up with a deeper pour than this side, it actually took on a slightly darker hue. It's very, very subtle, but it is noticeable, and it depends incredibly on the light in terms of how bright the light is, the color of the light, and the angle at which the light is striking these relative to your eye. So there are many times when I'm looking at these two boards and I cannot tell the color difference apart, but then in certain lights you can tell that this board is a very lighter shade of blue. I actually think this shade is a little more true to the way a real ocean or a deep lake would look, but nevertheless they don't exactly match up, and it's somewhat relative to the depth of the pour that was required for this board. It may also be part of the fact that because it has a larger surface area, I had to make successive pours, and as I got approaching the depth of this one, I wanted to shift over to a clear resin, but it would affect the edge line, and then you would see that this edge line would not match in color to this one. There's actually a very slight difference between the two, which is obviously not noticeable at this distance, but nevertheless, I was unable to shift the colors, so I had to apply more layers, and somehow between that combo of the depth and the added layers, because of its size, it did have that color shift result. But, saying that, I think overall, the effect that came out, if I pull back just a little bit further here, is pretty spectacular. I really like overall the way they came out. There's just a few areas that would be nice to improve. So that gives you a real distant look at these boards, and let's take a real close-up look at some key areas. So first I wanted to show you the vegetation that I've added along the shoreline. This is cotton fibers that I've then dyed with paint and then re-wet after it dried so that I could apply it in sort of a stringy mass along the shore. It's really meant to represent some kind of a weedy, grassy plant in the waterline that's then been washed up through, tides or wave action in a storm, something like that. Overall, I like the effect. It's a little bit of a challenge, and it's hard to get it to preserve its tint. I'm dyeing cotton, and it sort of ends up with a little bit of a washed-out gray effect, which looks a little matted, but in some sense, that kind of works as well. I suppose it's a matter of taste, whether it's appropriate in your eye, but I've been having a real challenge coming up with an alternative that could be used for this kind of an environment, as something like polyfill from Woodland Scenics is going to have a very fluffy finish, and it's not going to sit down. That's not an injury on my thumb, that's just paint. it's plaster actually, but it's not going to sit down flat like it's been washed up and then collapsed and dried the way seaweed is. So that's why I went with the cotton fibers, challenges be damned, and produced that effect. While we're here, it highlights one of the effects that you can get by pouring deep layers of resin that you can't really get any other way. I hadn't anticipated when I laid this rock down where exactly it would fall on the shoreline in terms of water depth, but you can see how it extends well below the surface of the resin and really adds an incredible amount of depth to this board. There's no real way you can get this kind of an illusion easily except doing something like this, at least in my opinion, and the other dioramas I've seen. So this is one of the benefits of doing a deep pour. How deep is the pour itself? Well, here you can see this is about a ½ inch here, and then this is about a ½ inch of resin, and you can see the stratifications of the layers as I poured them here along the line. But these two boards combined took almost 2/3 of a gallon, heading for the 3/4 of a gallon of resin mark. So that's no small amount of plastic to pour. And this one took, maybe 6 pours, which I can only do 1 to maybe 2 a day, depending on when I'm doing the timing of the pours. So that took quite a while to lay down those layers. Now, also in the water, let's see, it does show up on the camera. Here you can see this little patch right in here. What I did is I took some of these fibers from the cotton, I dyed them, and then I placed them in an upper layer after pouring the resin. You can see some in here as well. You can see some in here. So what I did is I put that down, let that set up, and then poured the resin over it. And I found actually that rather than trying to get it to sit down on the resin like this, which is kind of how I started it out, trying to get it matted down so it would have a low profile, I found that when I was pouring the resin, I was able to fluff it up with a toothpick as the resin was, because it takes 8 hours for this resin to cure. I was able to fluff it up a little bit, to dislodge bubbles, which it was entrapping a ton of air, but also to give it a more of a wispy floating look in the resin. If I had any improvements for that, it'd be perhaps to put it even 1 layer higher, as it's very subtle effect and you need quite a bit of bright light to be able to see it, but it is noticeable, it's clearly visible, you can see it even through this camera lens, and it does add something to the board that I think is kind of important. So it's something I'm going to, again, maybe try to continue to explore in a little more detail. And here you can see along the board, I also tried to add in a few pieces of wood that might have washed up on shore. These are pieces that I purchased, actually. I know, who buys sticks? But I did because it was winter and we had 6 feet of snow and I needed some wood for another project, so I bought a little package of what do they call it? I don't know, Woodland Scenic sells it in a little, it's all broken up bits of twigs and stuff, such like that. But anyway, I decided to dig out of there and put some down to give the effect of washed up, wood, again, like in a storm, and then tried to pile in some of the algae and reeds that had washed up around it to try to tie it into the scene a little bit more firmly. That's the effect that it gave. I didn't put too many down because I wasn't too sure about how they were going to look, but overall I think they add a little something to it that does really kind of help out with adding a little variety along the shore. A real challenge for me, though, was how much of this stuff to add around the shore. Really wasn't sure, so what I did is I just sort of spottily added it hither and thither in bands, rather than try to pile up a ton around it. Not only because I'm afraid it might be a little too cluttered if I had too much, but also it took quite a bit of time, and I had to do several rounds of experiments on how to dye this, how darkly, what did it look like when it dried, how to tease it out, how big does I put it down. I don't know. I've spent way too much time on these boards, to be honest with you. But in any case, I finally settled on this technique to try to give some effect without being too much more onerous to work on, and I hope I've been successful. Of course, the viewers will be the true judge of that. And lastly, I wanted to show one of the problems of the board, as I do try to highlight where errors have occurred and maybe problem solve how it could be fixed in the future, although I don't have a very good answer for this. One of the problems, you can see here in the back that this board is sitting down a little bit below. Normally, I'd shim that up. So if I shim this up, all right, and I shim up this edge to bring this flush, well, quite frankly, this board doesn't lift very well, and I didn't really think about it as having this big an impact. But what I did is when I poured these, I poured them using a dam that had a mark on it so that I could judge the how level they were. And what ended up happening is I ended up getting these two pretty close to each other, but I raised this edge on this side a little bit to help compensate for its shortness. And then what happened is it poured up deeper along the shoreline, and I can't push these up against each other during the pour because there's a big hardboard dam that runs down the side that retains all the resin while I'm pouring it. So I'd have to make some kind of an eyeball on it, and maybe I could make a little bit of a better judge, but nevertheless, it's not something I can check easily during the pour process. So this ended up pouring a little bit more up the shoreline here than I did on this board. So I kind of pushed some, weeds into that area to try to take the eye away from it and distract from it, but that did occur, and it's going to be just a hair off, when this back edge is raised up. There's going to be a slight gap right here, but otherwise it's a pretty good, depth of union here along the seams. So I don't know. I've never done anything like this before, and that means there's going to be little tiny problems as I go along. I think in the future, if I wanted to make more boards to add to this, I'm probably going to be in the same situation where I'm going to be plus or minus around 1/8 of an inch in matching that up along this, because even though I have a template to carve this slope, the thickness of the foam could create a small variation in that, as well as potential warping that the foam exhibits. This resin seemed to create a little bit of a warping on the boards that I hadn't really experienced before as I flattened them, and I do that by, let's see if I can show you underneath here, you can take a look. I melt the boards and bend them while I'm heating them. I heat them with a torch, and then I let that cool in the corrected shape. And that allows the boards then to have some tension that keeps them flat. But they ended up warping in any case, even after when I had poured the resin. And this should be dimensionally stable, so I don't know why that happened. But then I had to go back in and re-flatten them, and I don't know whether that exact leveling will be retained over time. So there are variables in this that are hard for me to iron out, especially on a first round go. So hopefully, that gives you some caveats to think about if it's a project that you want to take on in the future. And surely some more experimentation by me down the road will produce, slightly tighter results, but there may be some measure of difference between boards that I just necessarily can't easily control for. So, that's a lot of caveats that I just provided, but there are a lot of little intricacies in the boards, and I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I try to get everything as tight as I can. So, definitely a couple areas I'm a little disappointed in, but overall, really pleased with the very first time that I've ever poured, this kind of a multi-layer resin effect on two large, broad areas, and and I've learned in the past to try to prevent some problems that sometimes the resin can detach from the foam, or the Mod Podge can detach, so some scoring in between layers to help it bond to the surfaces has been done to give it some more long-term long-term durability. And of course, I always say, if anything I ever ship out, fails due to manufacturer defect, quote-unquote manufacturer, that even if that's a year away, 2 years away, that's something that should happen. This should never separate. I'm always happy to have pay you to ship it back to me, and I'll fix it free of charge. So, but in any case, overall, I give my sort of satisfaction level on this as very good. But there's definitely some areas I'd like to step it up next go around, and there may be some boards added to this series, depending on the customer's impressions of this once he gets them in hand. Perhaps a section that has a dock added to it, and other future boards possibly as well. So we'll see where the future goes with it, but hopefully you've enjoyed taking a look at it. And as I always say, comments are welcome down below. I really appreciate those, and I thank you for spending another 15 minutes or so with me watching another TerranScapes video. I do really appreciate it, and I'll talk to you soon.